So let's get started. Today we are starting the study of the book of Daniel. And I don't know about y'all, but this is the first time, I think, in my life that I've ever studied Daniel. I'm not sure I've ever read the whole thing. Kathy sent out a email. This is what the book that the teachers are using looks like. So if you want to get it, I got mine from Amazon. I think I paid $25 for it. They delivered it within one day. I couldn't believe it.
Yeah, ditto.
Yeah. So anyway, I'm going to start with the introduction and do bits and pieces of it. Jump in if you've got questions or comments, as always. The book of Daniel is it's almost like two different books. The first half is made up of stories, and then the second half is more apocalyptic in writing. And so there are some, the stories are about the Son of Man, and there are others where the evil power is depicted in the visions. Folks, both Jews and Christians, have looked at this book in slightly different ways, of course. But there is some numerology toward the back of it where people have tried to figure out, exactly when the end of the world is going to be and stuff like that. It is, in terms of where it is placed in the canon, in the Jewish scriptures, it is, now I've lost my place here. It is with the writings. It is not with the prophets. They look at it more as they have it after the book of Esther, because Esther is a court narrative set in the Persian period, before Ezra Nehemiah, which is an account of the experiences of Jewish exiles. And so that makes sense to them. In contrast, the Greek translation, which is where the Christian Bible, came from, it is written with the prophets. It is found right after the book of Ezekiel, a book that has many literary, thematic, and theological affinities. So, there is some similarity there. The differences between the Hebrew text and the Greek text are not simply a matter of placement within the canon, however. One important difference is that the Greek text is considerably longer, containing additional materials not found in the Hebrew Bible. These extra sections include the prayer of Azariah, the hymn of the three Jews, and the story of Susanna, and including the story of Bel and the dragon. So where have we heard those titles?
Disney? No. Movies? Books, movies?
Books in the Apocrypha. My, your memories are short. Remember when we studied the Apocrypha several years ago?
I remember doing that.
Well, Bel and the Dragon and Susanna and the prayer of Azariah are in the Apocrypha. And so
Are they separate books?
Well, they were additions to the book of Daniel.
Okay. Oh, now I remember. Okay.
Okay, yeah.
Slow,
they were additions.
slow.
Yeah, I haven't had enough coffee, have you? And I didn't remember all of these either, but they were additions to the book of Daniel. And then when the Protestants broke away from the Catholics, the Protestants went, no, those additions are not canonical. So they appear with Daniel in the Catholic Bible. And I forgot to look in my Jerusalem Bible to make sure of that. But anyway, but they're in the Apocrypha.
Okay.
So anyway, yeah, just and the introduction says, despite some reservations about their authenticity by early Christian interpreters, they were regarded as part of the book of Daniel by the Western Church until the split between the Protestants and the Catholics in the 16th century. Daniel is one thing that's different about this book. Daniel, the main character, is named in the first verse by name, period. That's it. Other books, when the main character is introduced, he is introduced by saying who his father was, where he lived, what he did for a living, stuff like that. Daniel is introduced as Daniel. So that's it. We don't know anything else about him. Now, the only other place that a Daniel is mentioned in ancient times goes back to the time of Noah and Job, which were written in antiquity. And there was a Daniel in Canaanite lore who worshiped a god named El. And so the word Daniel, etymologically, I think I did that right, is explained as my judge is El. And that was in Ugaritic literature, first time I'd seen that word, as an ancient figure, the father of years. And that follows his deity as an ancient one. So that's the only other place we've seen anybody named Daniel. The origin of the book, the traditional attribution is a presumption derived from the fact that the accounts of the vision are related in the first person, but the first half of the book refers to Daniel in the third person. So there's a split halfway through. It's 12 chapters. Daniel's referred to in the third person, the first 6 chapters, and then in first person as if he's writing it in the second half. So that's something a little different. The traditional view holds that the book was composed during the period of its historic setting, during the last days of the Babylonian Empire and the early Persian Empire, because it talks about him being, exiled in Babylon. The book begins by referring to Nebuchadnezzar's invasion of Jerusalem, and then later on, it speaks of King Belshazzar as the successor. And then later on, it also speaks of Darius of Mede. The problem with all of these citations is that historically, they don't match up. And one of my commentators said that this could be a literary device to say, okay, this is where this place is more or less in history. Don't get hung up on the details, because the historic details are not the point of the story. There's theological stuff here that's really the point. So don't drive yourself crazy trying to match up what Daniel says historically, because it's not going to work. The actual dating of the book, scholars have put it to late, much later, because the second half of the book talks about Antiochus Epiphanes, and he was the guy that desecrated the temple, and he came in the late 2nd century BCE, if I remember correctly, and he was part of the Seleucid dynasty, and he died at the end of 164 BCE. And so this, when we get to the second part, it's going to talk about things. He was the guy that the Maccabees revolted against.
So Sarah, what year does our author, or what time period was it written? Because I'm looking at the NIV Study Bible and it dates it around 530 BC.
No, it's going to be more. Antiochus Epiphanes died in 164 BCE, and he is talked about in the latter part of Daniel.
Sarah, was there some school thought that maybe the 2 parts of Daniel were written at different times? They're different. they have different settings.
Possibly, that was just mentioned in passing as if
Yeah.
that's a possibility, but it didn't get a lot of weight, which I took to mean that the scholars really didn't think so. You know, of course, that could just be my interpretation, because it certainly would make sense.
Yeah.
Another thing that is very strange about Daniel is that it is written in two different languages.
Mhm.
The first chapter and the last 5 or 6 chapters are written in Hebrew, and the chapters in between are written in Aramaic. And the question came to me this morning. I'm assuming that they share the same alphabet, but I'm not sure.
You know, Aramaic was a derivative or a language from Mesopotamia or Babylon. So, and now if you go back far enough, I guess you could say Hebrew is too, but I'm not sure about the same alphabet because they, you know, Christ spoke Aramaic, and I had read once, which was erroneous, that it was a kind of a slang of Hebrew, but it's really a derivative from the 70, 80 years that the Hebrews spent in Babylon, because there have been multiple generations born using that language. And I guess, you know, and they brought it back to Israel with them. So, you know, those languages, I think most of the Hebrews knew both very, very well, but I think
Yes.
yeah.
Mhm.
So Aramaic was probably, but that Aramaic began in the Babylonian, with the Jews in the Babylonian conquest, and that language came from Babylon.
Yeah. And one of the commentators makes the point that the Aramaic used in this book is later. You know, English changes over time. Well, Aramaic changed over time, and this was very formal, later Aramaic, and the writer was very fluent in Aramaic, where the Hebrew is very clumsy. And some words in the Hebrew section of Daniel are used over and over and over again, as if the person doesn't know another Hebrew word to use. So they use certain words way too much.
Let me share a passage from the NIV Bible that sort of argues for the earlier date. It says the language itself argues for a date earlier than the 2nd century. Linguistic evidence from the Dead Sea Scrolls, which furnish authentic samples of Hebrew and Aramaic writing from the 2nd century, demonstrates that the Hebrew and Aramaic chapters of Daniel must have been composed centuries earlier. Furthermore, as recently demonstrated, the Persian and Greek words in Daniel do not require a late date. Some of the technical terms appearing in chapter 3 were already so obsolete by the 2nd century BC that translators of the Septuagint translated them incorrectly. So,
Yeah. I mean, I wonder if the first half of Daniel was largely written at one point and the second half was written later.
that would make sense.
Yeah.
So, because there, you know, other books from the Old Testament really are a compilation of different writings. And so, you know, there weren't all the critical, you know, analyses in those days. And the editorial, you know, the editors, publishing editors weren't, you know, a thing at that time. So,
yeah, there were at least 3 different authors of Isaiah. So yeah.
Yeah. So it gives us perhaps a reflection of a pretty broad spectrum of time between the first half and the second half.
And
maybe?
I looked up just to try to. I'm so poor in history. I looked up Nebuchadnezzar in my Bible dictionary so I could get a handle on who exactly he was. Of course, there were 4 of them.
Oh.
And and I think it's number 2 that we're mainly concerned with. But there was a note in there that the part about his insanity, where you know he kind of loses his mind and goes off for a while, that was probably talking about a different person rather than Nebuchadnezzar. There was an actual person who had the mental breakdown. So yeah, it's hard to fit history into the Bible and make it nice and neat.
Right, because
Well-
it wasn't written to be historical
Yeah.
document. I don't
Yeah.
think, you know.
Nancy, the way to think about history is just, the story of one bad relative after another.
And there's a lot of disinformation that still exists to this day. Go ahead and weed through it.
Because it's the meaning that's the important part.
Yeah. And this is from the introduction of our book. The book of Daniel functions as scripture inasmuch as it instructs the community as to the ways of God and the ways that community members should conduct themselves before the sovereign God.
Yeah, but that's what it's about.
So that's, and so, never mind, I'll save that point for when I get to it. Yeah, one thing that Nancy was reminding me of, Antiochus Epiphanes that I was talking about, who's talked about in the later part of the book. He was part of the Seleucid Empire, and his father was king, and his older brother should have become king, but his older brother died. Well, then his nephew should have inherited, but the nephew was captive in Rome at that point. And so he took the opportunity to take the throne himself, which set a precedent so that other later relatives said, well, if he can do it, I can do it. And the whole empire ends up falling apart because everybody wants to be on the throne. So yeah, one bad relative after another. Okay, now this is something that, okay, going back to what Nancy was talking about. A review of the book's compositional history must take into consideration its bilingualism, namely the fact that chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 2, verse 4, and then chapter 8 through chapter 8:1 through 12:13 are in Hebrew, but 2:4 through 7:28 are in Aramaic. A number of scholars have proposed plausibly that most of the court dates of Daniel 1 through 6 once circulated independently in the late Persian and early Hellenistic periods. The accounts may also contain significant elements from earlier sources, but the stories themselves were probably already known in substantially their present forms by the late 4th or early 3rd century. So this author does talk about that possibility. In terms of literary genres, the beginning of Daniel is similar in 2 other biblical stories. If you read the first chapter, and I'm thinking some of you probably did that story remind you of another Old Testament hero?
Joseph? In front
Yes.
of-
To a degree.
Right, to a degree, there are differences.
Well, the author went to great lengths, trying to compare not liking the seasoning of Babylonian food with, Joseph turning down a hot to trot woman.
Yeah.
Now, 2 young men. I say this author was really slighting Joseph in his ability versus Nathan.
Yeah. So anyway, that comparison is certainly there. And another comparison is to the story of Esther. And I don't know how much y'all remember about Esther, because I don't know that we've ever studied her. That the crisis of Jews in exile and Daniel having a place in the court was reminiscent of Esther and her uncle. When one moves beyond the first 6 chapters, however, one encounters not a variety of situations, but one situation, an environment of a terrible oppression by an arrogant and a blasphemous tyrant. So when we get halfway through the book, you're going to see a big change there. And I'm just kind of skipping through this because I don't want to give away too much there. This is a section on the theological perspective. And this emphasis on God's giving at the outset should immediately signal that the book is primarily about God's power and activity, and only secondarily about any human model of excellence. Daniel and his friends succeed only because God has given them to grace and mercies, and God had given them the wherewithal to cope with their challenges with their faith intact. The sovereignty of God implies complete divine freedom, for the God who gave people into a situation of suffering, presumably as a divine judgment of sin, is also the God who delivers them from their terrible plight. The God of judgment is at once the God of grace.
What page were you on, Sarah?
That was on page 14 under theological perspective.
Mhm.
Does that not give pause, to think about that theorem? God may or may not help you,
Yeah. Okay, so that's a brief overview without getting too deep into it. So moving into chapter 1, would somebody be willing to read the first 2 verses?
I got it.
Okay.
In the 3rd year of the reign of King Jehoiakim of Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord let King Jehoiakim of Judah fall into his power, as well as some of the vessels of the house of God. These he brought to the land of Shinar and placed the vessels in the treasury of his gods.
And Shinar is today is southeastern Iraq.
Oh.
Okay, so chapter 1.
I was going to say it's an interesting theological statement that the Lord let King Jehoiakim of Judah fall into Nebuchadnezzar's power, as well as some of the vessels of the house of God. Okay.
Well, that's the whole, some of the whole thing there is that only if God deemed it would Israel fall, otherwise God was weak.
Yeah.
So by saying God let it or gave, Israel to, that keeps God being strong. So.
Yeah. So the stories here are set in the context of Israel's defeat and consequent exile. Details of the historical setting are difficult to coordinate. I talked about that earlier. In any case,
Looking at other historical evidence of the Nebuchadnezzar and all that.
Yeah, and this is on page 21. According to other passages in the Bible, Nebuchadnezzar did not officially begin to reign until the 4th year of Jehoiakim's reign. And number 2, although Babylon records indicate Nebuchadnezzar led a number of expeditions into Palestine when he was a crown prince, no attack on Jerusalem is mentioned. And then number 3, all sources indicate a siege in the year 597 during the reign not of Jehoiakim, but of another one, who would be pronounced almost the same way. And then again in 586, long after Jehoiakim had died. So, that's what I was talking about when I said the history that we know of from other sources just doesn't add up here. Don't get bogged down in the details. In any case, the notice serves its purpose well by providing a narrative setting to tell the stories of individuals who are trying to live out their convictions in a world dominated by those who do not share their faith. It is a world in which the will of God is difficult to discern in the face of seemingly insurmountable political power. At all events, the significance of the historical context is ultimately not to provide with raw data. The narrative suggests that God's will is being worked out amid the messiness of human history, even when the experience of exile and oppression obscure that will. The invaders entered the city. Sacred vessels that were not destroyed were carried away to a distant land and desecrated, and not even put in their temples, but just put into the treasury, like they just weren't worth a whole lot.
Mhm.
So that was a further insult. The repetition of the word house, which is used 3 times, and his God, Nebuchadnezzar's God, was used twice, is evident in the Hebrew text, but not in the Greek version. Nebuchadnezzar's aggression posed a profound theological problem, and that is highlighted by the Hebrew wordplay at the outset, indicating how one is to read the chapter and the rest of the book. The opening word suggests that this story, and indeed the entire book, is not so much about human beings faithful and heroic, although some of them may be, but about God's will and power in history. So the author of this book makes that point over and over and over again. And she points out that the narrator, in fact, returns to other aspects of sovereign God's giving. So God gave Jehoiakim to Nebuchadnezzar. God gives Daniel what he needs to get through this bad time. Now, to give you this gets into some interesting theology here. This land of Shinar that is the southeastern part of Iraq is also the area where the Tower of Babel, or Babel, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, was built. So what was the point of the Tower of Babel?
To reach heaven, to reach God.
Right. They wanted to go up and see God. And then what happened?
God got pissed, changed
God
all
got
the
pissed.
languages. He changed all the languages.
He
Until that
dispersed the
time,
people.
theoretically, we spoke the
Right.
same.
Yeah, he dispersed the people, and all the different groups ended up with different languages so that they would never be able to come together with one language and be so arrogant as these people were. Well, here comes Nebuchadnezzar, and he tries to bring all the people under his control and requires that they all learn how to speak his language. So he's in the same place where the Tower of Babel was built. He's trying to duplicate that effort. Okay. So that takes care of the first 2 verses. Would somebody else read verses 3 through 8?
Well, I've got it, but somebody else does too.
I can try.
Okay.
Then the king commanded his palace master, Ashpenaz, to bring some of the Israelites of the royal family and of the nobility, young men without physical defect and handsome, versed in every branch of wisdom, endowed with knowledge and insight, and competent to serve in the king's palace. They were to be taught the literature and language of the Chaldeans, or
Chaldean.
Chaldean.
Yeah.
The king assigned them a daily portion of the royal rations of food and wine. They were to be educated for 3 years, so that at the end of that time they could be stationed in the king's court. Among them were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah from the tribe of Judah. Can we just call them Manny, Mo, and Harry or something? The palace master gave them other names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, and Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. But Daniel, and you want me to go through 8?
Yes,
But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the royal rations of food and wine, so he asked the palace master to allow him not to defile himself.
right, so the king is Nebuchadnezzar.
Yes. So he is looking for the best and the brightest.
Uh-huh.
You
And the
know,
handsomest.
and the
Handsome,
handsomest. And the author of the commentary said that it's reminiscent of the requirements for high priest and for animal sacrifices, that we, you know, the best, most attractive, without blemish, were the people who could serve in the temple, and that was the characteristics of animals that you sacrifice to God. So looking for the best and the brightest and the smartest, and that it's, even today, it's not unusual, you know, in a situation for the government to look for the best and the brightest to give scholarships to.
Well, he was also being very wise in trying to assimilate the Hebrews into the Babylonian culture. I mean, he's taking the brightest Hebrew. So if he, you know, ultimately they will become part of the court, and you know, they're going to help keep the Hebrews in line, which are still at this point in bondage or slavery probably, and various things. So he's just trying to, you know, get his, you know, he's being pretty wise, I think, trying to assimilate somebody in the Hebrew faith that can bring the rest along or keep them in check.
Yeah.
That's what I think.
Yes, I agree. Anyway, he's picking the best because these people are already intellectually equipped to benefit the government. The verse that says to serve in the king's palace. And he expects those brought before him to be similar to the ones brought before God. And also to have, the NRSV uses the word versed, could also mean wise. That these are people of discernment who will teach many and ultimately bring many to righteousness. That Nebuchadnezzar could seek people with these qualities to serve his own agenda is ironic, for these are the precise characteristics of the people who are instrumental in the fulfillment of the will of God. The youngsters are to be educated for 3 years, which according to some ancient Persian and Greek sources was the standard period for higher education that typically began when the boys were 14 and lasted until they were 16 or 17. Now, mixed in with this opportunity, of course, are temptations, which is, you know, the part about assimilating into the culture. Apparently, changing the name didn't bother them. They said, you know, okay, we'll go with these new names. Their Hebrew names, Daniel means my judge is God. Hananiah's name means the Lord is gracious. Mishael's name means who is what God is. And Azariah means the Lord has helped. It's not unusual for,
Don't you think part of the reason they didn't care about the names, well, the author brought this out, I think, they meant nothing. The new names didn't have a meaning. They were gibberish.
Right.
So it wasn't like the new names were saying, I will honor the new gods, you know, or something like that. They were just gibberish. So I think that's why they didn't care about taking on the new names.
yeah. Yeah, there's literally, you know, scholars have looked for some meaning for those names, and they literally don't mean, they have no meaning. So he didn't mind that, but Daniel kind of drew a line in the sand at accepting the food. And there's no detail in terms of why it was considered offensive to him or objectionable. Certainly there's nothing objectionable about drinking wine. And King Joachim, he accepted the food and drink. So Daniel is being shown here as being more devout than the king actually was. There's some speculation here that the food and drink may have been offered to the pagan gods before it was given to the young men. But Daniel has said, this is where I draw my line.
Well,
I'm
it probably wasn't kosher.
Right.
Mhm.
So I kind of was surprised that this author didn't say that directly.
No.
She just kind of beat around the bush, kind of.
And also, she later said that probably the vegetables were also offered to the gods first also, so that may not have been a workable theorem.
Yeah. So can't remember who was the first. Daniel goes to, who did he go to first? The chief warden. I think he goes to the chief warden and says, we're not going to eat this. We want, the word lentils is used literally seeds. He wanted to subsist just on seeds and water. And the chief warden was concerned for his job, because if these chosen young men end up dying of starvation, it's his head. So then he goes to the guard and says, we really just want to eat lentils and water. And the guard figures out a way to do it without endangering himself. And Daniel offers an experiment and says, feed us this for 10 days. And at the end of the 10 days, if we don't look at least as good as the folks who are getting all of the really good stuff, then, we'll eat the good stuff. Well, 10 days later, Daniel and his friends actually look better than the guys getting all the really good stuff. So,
In my translation, used vegetables,
Yeah.
like a variety of vegetables. I don't know. But
Yeah.
that's mine.
so let me read a little bit that I underlined here. The language of corruption or defilement is noteworthy too, for it suggests that at issue is one's moral and religious self. Imperial largesse for education and the imposition of meaningless names are not perceived as threats to one's moral identity in the way the consumption of the king's delicacies and wine seems to be. So,
Were there dietary laws that applied to vegetables? The ones that I can think of related to meat.
I mean, it's to everything. At least, in current times, if you put the food in a refrigerator that's not kosher, the food is then, even if it was kosher before, it's then not kosher. So, I mean, it's really broad reaching.
Okay.
so
All
what
right.
constitutes a kosher refrigerator?
I never got to that point. I
Well,
just
well,
understood that, like, wow, no matter what I do, this food's gonna fail,
Okay.
It seems to me, recalling some of the HGTV programs that I have watched, that they were redoing a kitchen for a very Orthodox Jewish couple, and they actually had two refrigerators. They had to keep the meat separate from the dairy, I believe, and you couldn't cross-contaminate.
Yeah. And I can remember stories, I read this somewhere years and years ago, that, and I don't know how you'd have enough room to store this, that you actually had to have, in fairly modern day, our grandparents' time, certainly, a set of dishes to be used to serve meat on, and a set of dishes to be used to serve dairy on. And you never put meat on the dairy plates or dairy on the meat plates. And then you had another separate set for Sunday, for Sabbath, not for Sunday, but for the Sabbath.
And there's even, I remember some cases as extreme as they had a Passover kitchen, that there was a tiny little separate area that was only used as a kitchen for the Passover time.
yeah,
Wow.
but the scripture, the book gives us no clue, and we're talking about a 14-year-old boy. And that's almost 586 years before Christ. So, I'm just, without any inkling in the book, it could just as easily be that he just didn't like the spices. Or, I mean, it could be anything, because we're not really given anything. And a 14-year-old boy is not going to know but so much about a, kosher kitchen, or how this is done or that is done. I mean, I just think the author may be trying to draw straws where there are no straws to draw, Or, I mean, common theology about this. I mean, we are talking about young boys here,
Yeah, 'cause I was wondering if Daniel asked for the vegetables because it would be easier than trying to negotiate other things. So who knows? There's a lot we don't know. We're
Yeah,
just
and when
speculating.
you get right down to it, boys wouldn't have known diddly squat about what went on in the kitchen anyway.
Right.
That was up to the women
Barely.
to keep stuff kosher.
Yeah, yeah, but I would think that the guys would have at least some general idea of.
They
Yeah,
still
they-
don't, a lot of them.
Well, they would know not to eat pork.
Yes. They
Oh,
would
yeah.
know the big rules they would know, I would think.
Yeah.
I can't help but think about this. When one of my parents' restaurants was in a downtown business area, and it was nothing to look at and see a Catholic priest, the rabbi, and Jerry Falwell all sitting at a great big table in this particular section of the restaurant having barbecue chicken.
Well, that's a good compromise. You're eating chicken.
That's funny. Oh, I guess Tom everything just scrambled on my screen. Went, oh, Tom just went to be an elder.
Yeah, and I'll have to leave in a couple of minutes.
Yeah, we've only got a few more minutes. So I think I'm not going to go into the next section. Again, something that I just underlined in my reading, the king's offer in this regard, in terms of the food, was dangerous because of its consequence, the loss of identity. I don't know. And Daniel's determination to resist the temptation enabled him to be in solidarity with the wretchedness of the other captives, who apparently were not getting really good food offered to them. In his will to resist, therefore, he identifies himself with others in their desperate straits. And then our author goes on to talk about how people today can identify themselves in one way or another by deciding to be vegetarian or refusing to buy things made in China, or trying to cut down on their consumption of plastic, that type of thing. And saying that Daniel was just using this as a way to identify who he was. So
To maintain that.
That's as
Yeah.
good as anything else.
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
and this thought just popped into my head, that was a visible thing to do. Anybody watching him eat would go, oh, you're different. Why are you doing this differently from the rest of us?
Mm-hmm.
And young people don't have to be real logical. Although my daughter is quite a bit older than that, but she won't eat chicken because the terrible way they're raised. I mean, she's vegan, so chickens are abused. And yes, you'll buy Nike products that are made probably by slaves in China. It's just this. Young people have blind spots. You get on one bandwagon, but have blind spots for other things. I suspect Daniel may have been no different.
Yeah, and I expect there are plenty of old people that also have similar.
Oh,
Some blind spots. Yeah, we all
No,
do. We all have some
not,
kind of
well,
blind spot.
not me, of course.
No, I wasn't talking about you, Harold.
Well, no, I mean, I just wanted to clarify.
Yeah, we all got that clarification. Well, this is a little bit early to end things, but it's at a break in the book, so I am gonna end it here, so everybody has plenty of time to go to the bathroom and get another cup of coffee before you go to church.
Oh, you're right on time, Sarah. You're supposed to end at 10:50.
Oh, okay. I can't see my clock is
2:49
moved, so I
right
can't
now.
tell what time it is. Okay.
But before we go, does anybody have any updates on Steve Goff? How's he getting along?
Just what was in the Wednesday news email that he
On
was
to rehab?
going to rehab, probably at Sheltering Arms.
Okay.
Oh, I do have an update on Marianne Castia. She has improved tremendously. Is actually no longer using the walker, is getting around on a cane.
Good for her. Good for her.
Yeah.
Nancy,
Yes?
you earlier you referred to your biblical dictionary.
Yes, I actually,
I gotta
Francis
go.
Atherton turned me on to this at one of the CWF meetings, and I
Can you
was
bring it a
so
little bit
impressed with it.
closer?
Yeah,
Little bit
Harper's Bible Dictionary. It's an old classic.
I ordered it
Okay.
on Amazon
Yeah.
and got
Good,
it pretty
because
quick.
when I was reading Daniel, I was like, oh God, I don't understand this. What's this word mean?
Yeah.
Okay, thank
Okay.
you.
Janet, it was nice to have you. I hope you come back.
Thank you. I'm sure I will.
Uh-huh.
Okay. Bye, y'all.
Bye-bye, thank you.
Thanks.
Sarah?